Hello, my name is Mark Firmerman, presenting my final project for Psychology of Personal Effectiveness. The topic I chose is invasive species. So, what is an invasive species? They are a species that is non-native to the environment, brought from another place. They also spread aggressively, which I personally justify with the evolutionary theory that states predators evolve alongside their prey. So when the predator is let loose in a new environment, the other animals aren't really ready for it. It's kind of like an all-you-can-eat buffet for the predator. And so vice versa, when the prey is placed in a new environment with no predators, there's nothing to keep their population in check. Another reason why invasive species is considered invasive is because they ruin ecosystems. They do so by preventing native species from reproducing by outcompeting them for food and resources, and sometimes they even bring diseases. According to the National Wildlife Federation, approximately 42% of endangered species are at risk primarily due to invasive species. So, what does an invasive species look like? They come in the form of plants, which can either be aquatic plants or terrestrial plants. And also, of course, there's animals, which everybody usually thinks of. Of course, everything can be invasive if it's just taken from one place and put in another place with no predators or prey. Insects and spiders, birds, fish, mammals, and rodents, reptiles, and amphibians can all be invasive species. There's also bacteria, and there's actually about 10 animal invasive pathogens, things like fowlpox and the West Nile virus, which, according to the CDC, since 1999, an estimated 700,000 people in the United States have become ill due to West Nile virus infection, and of those, nearly 19,000 people have had infections of the brain or spinal cord, and more than 1,700 people have died. There's about 20 plant invasive pathogens, such as sudden oak death and citrus greening, which the USDA just recently discovered is native to Asia and was first discovered in 2005 in Florida. It is currently on the Florida invasive species list. So how do invasive species get to new geographical areas? It's mainly due to human activity. They're a lot of the times transported on board ships. I mean, it's hard to imagine how many thousands of these massive commercial ships go from continent to continent each year. On top of that, it's likely about 1,000 private yachts cross the Atlantic each year, whose onboard cargo is much harder to regulate in regards of species hanging on and being undetected. A lot of the times they are transported through wood products. Insects, spiders, and fungi store themselves in cracks and gaps, and the pet trade is, of course, responsible for this. There's invasive animals, and exotic animals often are let loose by owners when they can't take care of them anymore or simply escape. And there's invasive plants, which mostly are transported on hikers' boots by the wind down roads and highways and down rivers or streams to new lands. Some invasive species that you can find in South Florida are Burmese pythons, which can grow up to 23 feet long and weigh 200 pounds. In a study conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey, the python infestation in the Everglades has caused populations of raccoons to drop 99.3%, opossums 98.9%, and bobcats 87.5%. Marsh and cottontail rabbits, as well as foxes, are no longer seen at all in the Everglades. You can also find giant African land snails in Florida, which can lay 30 to 1,000 eggs at a time, 6 times a year, and 90% of the hatchlings survive. And this is warned by actually a store in UK, an online pet store that sells you these snails. And you can also find a ton of purple swamp hen in Florida, which escaped from Miami Metro Zoo during Hurricane Andrew originally, and now populate and breed in the wild. Some invasive species that cover the United States, well, you can find kudzu just about everywhere. This is referred to as the vine that ate the South. Kudzu grows as fast as a foot per day. It was originally introduced in the 1935s when the government paid farmers to plant this in an attempt to prevent soil erosion, and as you can tell now, it's just about fully taken over. You can find round goby in the United States. In 2011, the University of Minnesota recorded that densities of gobies in rocky areas at Calumet Harbor already exceeded 20 per square meter. And just to give you an idea, that's about 20 fish in a space the size of a bathtub throughout this whole entire harbor. And by the way, that harbor is connected to the Grand Calumet River, which is connected to the Mississippi River, which runs through the entire United States. So we will be seeing these fish everywhere pretty shortly here. Cats are also invasive in the U.S. That's a not very commonly known fact, but the first place they were introduced to this continent is now known as Florida. They were brought by the Spanish in 1498. Undomesticated and outdoor cats have already been implicated in 33 modern bird, mammal, and reptile extinctions. Invasive species in different parts of the world. In Australia, you can find cane toads. An article by Time magazine states the toads were brought to Australia in 1935 in an attempt to control the cane beetle population in sugar plantations. Ultimately, there was no evidence that the toads killed a single beetle. There are giant Asian hornets, which are going to become a huge problem for the world pretty soon here. They originated in China. In 2013, they actually killed 42 people in a 3-month period, and almost 1,700 were injured from swarm attacks. In the last 4 years, since 2011, hornets made it to France, and there's already no hope, basically, for full eradication. That's because each queen produces 300 queens. That is crazy exponential growth, and they really are taking a toll on people. You can find the European rabbit on every single continent except for Antarctica, as well as Norway rats, also known as brown rats or sewer rats, originally from China, can now be found on every continent of the world except Antarctica. So what can we as individuals do about invasive species? Well, we can try as hard as we can to predict and prevent invasive species from spreading. In 2011, the University of Indiana began developing a predictive model to predict what locations on a given property are most likely to be invaded by a new species. Another method of prevention is literally interfering with the species' entry into countries at airports and shipyards until they are checked for hitchhikers. Well, we can also manage the spread by getting together and creating government agencies against the spread, empowering civilians in their communities to take action. Annually, the United States uses about $120 billion to manage our invasive species, and all the countries of the world combined amount to about $1.4 trillion annually. So it is definitely a problem. We can also try introducing predators to the environment. This is what the Australians tried to do by bringing frogs to keep the beetle population in check. But also this poses a huge risk of the newly introduced predator becoming an invasive species. So which predator to use and its long-term effects on bringing it into the ecosystem must be calculated in advance, as learned the hard way by our Australians who now have a frog problem. And we can also, as individuals, develop an appetite for invasive species. For example, gray squirrels are invasive in Great Britain, which are originally from here, from North America. Now they've made their way over there, and they actually eat 7 times more food than native British red squirrels, which makes a big difference during winter when food is limited. One British game shop owner's motto is "Eat a gray and save a red." So that concludes it for my presentation. Thank you so much for having me in your class, Professor. It was really my pleasure, and enjoy your break.